In this lesson, we're going to look at converting the primitive and edge groups that we made in the last lesson to point groups. And this process of converting a group from one geometry type to another is what Houdini calls promoting a group. The reason we're going to promote these groups to point groups is that we're going to use them to reposition and pose this front leg. I want to straighten it up and out as though it's reaching for something. In the last lesson, I purposefully saved each of these different leg segments as different component group types to demonstrate how we create and select different types of groups on a piece of geometry. But having each leg segment saved as a different group type isn't really ideal for the purpose of this task. I want to transform each of these grouped segments using a soft transform node so that I can modulate the transform through the joint portions of the leg, but the soft transform node only operates on point selections. For example, this end leg segment saved as a primitive selection, so I'll switch to primitive selection mode and select this group from the group list. Now I'll bring up my radial menu and I'll swipe up through adjust and select the soft transform node, and we see that it hasn't worked as we'd maybe expect. It hasn't added a soft transform node to the network, and we see that Houdini switched me into a point selection mode because it's a point selection that the soft transform node expects. So I could switch back to primitive selection and select this front leg group again, and then convert that selection to a point selection by hitting Ctrl Shift and the 2 key. Now if I bring up the radial menu and swipe through and select the soft transform node again, we see that this time a soft transform node does get added to the network, and that point selection's been added to the group parameter field. And now I can use the transform handle to transform these points. What would be far more convenient would be to have these three groups all as point groups rather than as three different group types. We can change a group from one type to another using a group promote node. So I'll just move this soft transform node over to the side, and I'll add a group promote node after this last group node in the network. At the end of this group name parameter, we have this drop down, and in the top section of this list, we can see all the primitive groups which exist on the geometry. In this section, we can see all the point groups on the geometry, and in this section, we can see all the edge groups. We can also see certain attribute values which are stored on the geometry, and we'll talk about selecting geometry components by attribute later on. For now, we're going to stay focused on promoting groups, so I'll choose the front leg end group, and now this convert from parameters are already set to automatically read the type of group which I've selected, and by default it's set to convert it to a point group, which is what I want. In the group list, we can see that the front leg end group's now listed as a point group, and we can see the same if I bring up the node info for the group promote node. Now I also want to convert the edge group which I created for the mid section of the leg to a point group. So I'll come back to the group name drop down, and here I'll select that front leg mid group, and now we see that the group's been added to this group name parameter. We'll be talking more about group syntax for entering group names into these group parameters later on, but the important thing to note here is that we can have multiple groups listed in a group parameter, and it's a space which is used as a separator between the individual groups. The fact that a space is used to separate groups in group parameters is the reason that we can't have spaces in group names. So entering these two groups into this parameter on the group promote nodes, all we need to do to convert these primitive and edge groups to point groups. And now we can see in the group list that all three of our front leg groups are all now point groups. And again, we can see the same thing by viewing the node info. I'll come back over to the viewport and I'll tap the 9 key to enable the select by groups mode. And now I can easily select each of these three different leg segments directly in the viewport. Of course, I could have just created 3 point groups to start with, but the reason I initially created separate point, edge and primitive groups was to demonstrate how groups are specific to individual geometry types, and so that we can see how we convert groups from one type to another using a group promote node.